minority rights in India. My name is Peter Prove. I'm Director for International Affairs at the World Council of Churches in Geneva, and I'm really honored to have been invited to moderate this webinar on behalf of the organizers, the presenters of the content that has been prepared. Under the name of the Coalition for Minority Rights in India, a coalition which comprises the World Evangelical Alliance, Open Doors International, the Indian American Muslim Council, Hindus for Human Rights, Justice for All, and the International Commission for Dalit Rights. The issue and the concern that brings this coalition together is for an inclusive, pluralistic, and multi-faith society in India, and a shared alarm at deterioration of these values, and in particular of the situation of minorities, the rule of law, and the overall health of India's democracy in this current historical moment. This webinar takes place in conjunction with the 51st session of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations and ahead of the Universal Periodic Review of India later this year. So we have a very, very brief amount of time available to cover very extensive and heavy subjects. And so without further ado, I'm going to invite the first speaker to begin our session. So opening remarks will be offered by Dr. Andrea Benzo, Special Envoy for Freedom of Information, Freedom of Religion or Belief Protection and Interreligious Dialogue of Italy. Dr. Benzo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon from Rome to everyone. I would like, first of all, to thank the Coalition for Minority Rights in India for their invitation, in particular Open Doors, and to congratulate them on their relentless work in defense of freedom of religion or belief and minority rights. I'm also grateful to the coalition members that co-authored the reports on religious minorities in India for shedding light on such an important issue ahead of the upcoming UPR. And I'm also very glad to be part of this panel along such distinguished guests. Delighted to see Dr. Fernand de Varennes and Dr. Nazila Ghanea among us. Your initiative is particularly remarkable as it constitutes a meaningful example of interreligious cooperation on an issue of common concern, bringing together Christians, Muslims, and Hindus to speak out about the condition of religious minorities in India shows that the protection of FoRB is not a parochial or partisan interest, but rather a shared objective across all communities. Considering its cultural and historical background, Italy has always placed FoRB at the heart of its foreign policy agenda. Preventing marginalization, discrimination, and violence on grounds of religion or belief is an imperative for any country that seeks stability, development, and prosperity, both domestically and internationally. If any person is denied the right to participate in public life on account of religion or belief, society becomes fragmented, divided, and impoverished. This is precisely the reason why FoRB protection is and should remain in everybody's interest, be it governments or religious institutions, be it larger or smaller communities. FoRB protection is not a Western concern either, as sometimes it is portrayed. And to highlight this point, as today we are speaking of India, I would like to recall some of the milestones in the construction of peaceful and cooperative interfaith relations in this country. In the 3rd century before the Christian era, Emperor Ashoka, whose kingdom covered most of the Indian subcontinent and stretched from today's Afghanistan to Bangladesh, enacted some of the earliest legislation on the promotion of interreligious coexistence and tolerance. To this purpose, he adopted several edicts that were then carved on rocks across the country. In one of these inscriptions, it was said that, I quote, "The king honors all religious sects with gifts and with honors of various kinds, but he does not value gifts or honor as much as the promotion of the essentials of all religious sects, and other sects should be honored on every occasion. Acting thus, one promotes one's own sect and benefits others' sects. Acting otherwise, one both harms one's own sect and wrongs other sects. Coming together is good, so that people should both hear and appreciate each other's teaching. End of quotation. Like Emperor Constantine 5 centuries later in Europe, Ashoka realized that religious intolerance endangered the stability of its empire. In addition to that, he was mindful of the nefarious effects of what we would call today hate speech. Religious diversity has always been a hallmark in India's history, not only in ancient times, as many religious communities were granted the right to settle in its territory across centuries. In the second half of the 16th century of our era, Emperor Akbar the Great, a member of the Mughal dynasty, developed a policy of religious equality. He abolished the jizya, the tax that used to be levied on non-Muslim subjects in Islamic countries in exchange for protection, and established the principle of universal peace as the foundation of interfaith relations in India. He declared that no man should be interfered with on account of religion, and anyone is to be allowed to go over to a religion that pleases him. His commitment to religious freedom was not confined to granting freedom of worship to all subjects. To foster interreligious exchange, Akbar established the House of Worship, a place where he used to gather representatives of different faiths to encourage open discussions among them based on reason instead of bigotry. As much as Ashoka, Akbar understood that religious diversity should be promoted as a driver for prosperity, and that any policy seek to impose artificial uniformity would weaken any society in the long run, even the most prosperous one. More recently, one of the icons in Indian history and the prominent Hindu personality, Mahatma Gandhi, embodied the same values of openness, respect, and mutual understanding that have inspired other rulers in the past. To explain the need to reject any unilateral view of life and embrace inclusivism, he used to tell the story of 7 blind men who gave different descriptions of the same elephant that they had touched. I quote, "The 7 blind men who gave 7 different descriptions of the elephant were all right from the respective points of view and wrong from the point of view of one another." I very much like this doctrine of the manyness of reality. It is this doctrine that has taught me to judge a Muslim from his standpoint and a Christian from his. End of quotation. At the last UPR of India in 2017, Italy formulated a recommendation on abolishing anti-conversion laws and granting access to justice to victims of religious violence and discrimination. 5 years later, there are still challenges that need to be addressed to ensure all persons can fully enjoy all their rights under the law, irrespective of their religion or belief. It is my sincere hope that its legacy of religious diversity and equality, inclusion, and interfaith cooperation will inspire India while building its future. Thank you again for the opportunity to join today's event. I very much look forward to listening to the other panelists and wish all the coalition members every success in their endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Benzo, and I particularly want to thank you for grounding this discussion in some of the historical sources in the Indian cultural context of respect for diversity and of inclusiveness. Indeed, I think that some of these historical sources represent some of the earliest thinking that substantiates and gives a foundation for modern international human rights law. So thank you for putting that at the start of our discussion. And before I introduce the next speaker, I just want to remind all participants, all those in the audience online, to please make use of the question and answer function of this webinar. So already pose your questions in the question and answer function, so that hopefully, if time permits, we can pick up some of those questions and have the speakers respond to them before the end of this hour-long webinar. So now I move to the next speaker, Dr. Fernand de Varennes, who serves as UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues, who will speak to the topic of negative impact of violations on minorities. Dr. de Varennes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. Ladies and gentlemen, bonjour tout le monde. Namaste, assalamu alaikum. First, please allow me to thank all the members of the Coalition for Minority Rights in India for the kind invitation and honor of being part of this webinar. And I also wanted to commend you on your March 2022 report for the UPR of India. I think it's essential reading to understand the magnitude and gravity of the human rights situation and violations that are being experienced by religious and other minorities. Essential, but also uncomfortable reading, we have to admit. I've also raised many of the concerns expressed in this report in a number of communications, thematic reports, and statements with other special rapporteur colleagues in recent years. The overall impression is that there is an alarming deterioration of the protection of minorities and their human rights. And I think what needs to be emphasized is that many of these human rights violations are not simply involving large numbers of individuals. They involve, in addition, a pattern of targeting of specific minorities as a community, as a group, in their entirety, as somewhat, in some cases, alien or threatening others, and somehow that they don't really belong or are not as deserving as other members of the country in India. Now, time does not permit me to go into great detail, but there is clearly a pattern of stigmatization and targeting minorities in India. And this includes using legislation such as the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act to shut down and shut up critics, including human rights defenders, in the name sometimes of national interest. And there is anecdotal evidence that suggests, once again, that organizations that are defending minorities are disproportionately targeted and impacted. Now, of course, this is very complex. There are nuances in every situation. But it's clear, for example, that hate speech and incitement to violence in social media has been increasing significantly. And also that there is increasing violence and brutality in recent years, targeting, once again, mainly minorities such as Muslims, Christians, and others. Many of you will know about minority Muslim women in recent years having experienced denigration, threats, and harassment in social media applications such as Suli Deals and Buli Bai, where they were listed for auction with photographs sourced without permission, obviously, and doctored. And to be blunt, and as some of you know, the word Suli is used as a derogatory Islamophobic slur, targeting Muslim females, Muslim women in India. There's increasingly extremely violent and hate speech stigmatizing religious or belief minorities and other minorities such as Dalits, including by senior political figures in social media. And what we're seeing is increasing hostility and violence against religious minorities, particularly Muslims. Muslims and other religious or belief minorities are massively the targets of hate speech. I've raised this in a number of reports and communications, including in my 2021 report to the UN Human Rights Council. And I also recently called for the protection of Dalit and minority women and girls from rape and sexual violence, and that this should be a national priority in India, and that the government needed to address these atrocities too often committed in the country by tackling the underlying prejudice, hate, and dehumanizing of Dalits and other minorities, which create the environment where women and girls become easy targets for such attacks. Unfortunately, there's also a growing threat of impunity, as too often those committing crimes against minorities are not always prosecuted or punished. And here again, there seems to be a trend. Unfortunately, again, while there are some prosecutions, especially of those who are rather high profile, and those who incite violence and hate speech against minorities, this doesn't happen consistently or sufficiently, even in high profile cases. And I expressed my concern very recently at the release of 11 men who had been jailed for gang raping a Muslim woman. The picture many observers have painted in India is of growing intolerance and exclusion, and this includes anti-conversion laws, such as more recently in Karnataka, which legitimately, on the one hand, address coercive conversions, but then goes much further and makes it an offense to entice a conversion with a promise of marriage or other temptations, such as, quote unquote, better lifestyle. And this allows in very vague language civil servants to intervene, even to annul a marriage and any conversion that would be considered contrary to freedom of religion as understood under this legislation. Observers have pointed out that it appears the intention here to intimidate, to target minorities, especially those of Christian and Muslim faith in the state. When you look at this, exclusion of specific religious or other minorities is to be seen as taking root, even in relation to the most basic of rights, such as citizenship. In 2019, many of you know the National Citizenship Register was published for Assam, and as my and other UN mandates have indicated in a communication to the Indian government, we were and remain deeply concerned that close to 2 million people were left out of the list that was released, and that they now have to go through a judicial process which has its own problems to establish their citizenship. And that process is largely stalled, most recently in part because of the pandemic, but there are other systemic reasons. The 2 million people who may become stateless, amongst the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, seems are mainly members of Muslim, Bengali, and other minorities. This is not accidental, as our communication emphasized. That same year, 2019, and once again, it would be difficult to believe that this is a coincidence, India passed the Citizenship Amendment Act, which fast-tracks citizenship for Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsi, and Christian immigrants from the region who arrived in India before 2015, but lo and behold, it excludes Muslims. Not a coincidence. If you combine this with ongoing citizens or citizen registration drive in other parts of India, which have been described as means of excluding mainly Muslim and some other minority populations from Indian citizenship, we are seeing a risk of statelessness for millions and millions in the country. I could go on and on. There is the recently amended presidential constitution scheduled caste order of 1950, which was changed, which now excludes affirmative actions measures for Dalits who are Christian and Muslims. You have cow slaughter laws, which have been used to punish and even criminalize members of certain minority communities. And more strikingly, as I and other special rapporteurs have pointed out, there is the revocation of the constitutional special status of Indian-administered Kashmir, where Muslims are concentrated, and which largely disenfranchises them and weakens their legal protections as members of a minority in India that they had when Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, was a union territory with its own autonomy and government. There's only now one small union territory where most of the population is Muslim, which has maintained its autonomy, Lakshadweep. But even here, direct control from Delhi has increased in recent years, including an increased migration from outside the union of non-Muslims. The scale of denial of the human rights of these minorities, even through legislation and its application in the judicial system, is its systemic and national scope. The refusal of authorities to engage fully with global human rights mechanisms, including special procedures, and in some cases, the rising brutality and incitement of hatred and violence against minorities are of such gravity and magnitude, as I said at the start, that the international community needs, in my opinion, to step up to the task if we're serious about reversing the trend, a trend of a systemic pattern where certain minorities are targeted, marginalized, and demonized, and become less than second-class citizens because of their religion, or belief. It would seem, and I will conclude with this, that nothing short of perhaps an international investigative mechanism, as has been done by UN Security Council, Human Rights Council, or Human Rights Council resolutions for countries such as Syria, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Ethiopia, may be necessary, or some kind of similar report as was prepared under the UN Human Rights High Commissioner, even though that was delayed, on the Uyghurs in China. And I hope this panel will consider this and other ways forward to reverse a trend, which unchanged will bring us back to a very dark period of our history, where some minorities were not considered to be equal human beings in dignity, respect, and rights. I look forward to hearing the knowledge and exchanges from all of you later today. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Shukran. Dhanyavad.
Thank you very much, Dr. de Varennes. Thank you also for mentioning the UPR submission that members of this coalition came together to submit for the UPR of India later this year. And I'd just like to point out to participants that the link to that submission, the joint stakeholder report, has been posted in the chat function. So you can access that report for your own reading now or later. Now I move on to the next speaker, who is Dr. Nazila Ghanea, who serves as UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. Dr. Ghanea, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you and with colleagues on this distinguished panel. I want to thank the coalition and the members of the coalition for coming together to address this highly important topic. What I want to do is provide something of an overview of how the special procedures have engaged on this issue over a number of years. Professor de Varennes already referred to it, and I want to echo his concerns, and maybe I'll just give some more details about the data, about how much this concern has been accumulating in recent years. I also want to echo his concern that I appreciated the fact that he looked at minority rights within, in an indivisible and interrelated way with all other human rights. And I want to take the same approach to freedom of religion or belief, which, of course, entails non-discrimination and equality, that irrespective of our thought, conscience, religion, or belief, we should be treated equally and with respect. And not only should our freedom of religion or belief be upheld, but there shouldn't be any discrimination regarding any other rights. And of course, it's not only citizenship that entails human rights. States have responsibilities to all within their jurisdiction, irrespective of their status. Although, of course, a targeted extinguishment of citizenship or withdrawal of citizenship, of course, is evidence of discrimination. I've only been in the mandate for 2 months, but it's still long enough to be familiar with this trend and this concerning trends. So I appreciate that you came together before the November 2022 UPR session to address these important issues. It is an opportunity within the UN human rights mechanisms to bring forward actionable recommendations for the government of India to seek to reverse these worrisome trends affecting, amongst others, religious minorities such as Muslims and Christians. In this sense, we can highlight the FoRB, the freedom of religion or belief related recommendations that were raised in the 2017 UPR of India in the third cycle. They were noted by the government, but they all remain still highly relevant. The FoRB mandate has been constantly passing on concerns regarding a number of situations in India that demonstrate the need for further action. For instance, in February 2022, the special procedures mandate holders expressed public concern over the unilateral revocation by the central government of the special autonomous status granted by Jammu and Kashmir, as Professor Varennes referred to. This removed a number of guarantees providing special protection to minorities, including the Muslim minority. The number of communications sent by the FoRB mandate to India, mostly joint with other special rapporteurs, has steadily increased since 2017. So there have been 23 communications raising concerns since 2017, which lies in stark contrast with the one communication between 2012 and 2016. In most cases, unfortunately, the government did not provide substantive replies. Just in the last 4 months, my predecessor and I sent 4 communications to India, transmitting to the authorities concern regarding a broad range of actors and a number of situations. For example, the prohibition of hijabs in pre-university colleges in Karnataka state, which can obviously set a detrimental precedent for marginalizing Muslim women and girls and deny them access to education. There was another communication regarding forced eviction and housing demolitions against Muslim minority communities in Pradesh and Gujarat states and New Delhi, which can be seen as a form of collective punishment for alleged participation in intercommunal, interreligious events. There was also the lack of identification and preservation of mass burial sites and lack of accountability in the Kashmir region in the context of a broader pattern of restrictions of rights in Jammu and Kashmir. Also, there was one communication regarding gender-based violence against Muslim women. This has not yet been published, but it will be published and made public shortly. These communications add to previous engagements, statements, communications, public reports that raise critical human rights issues. There was the alert launched by the Special Rapporteur on FoRB and other stakeholders regarding seeking to prevent the adoption of the Citizenship Amendment Act in 2019, as it discriminates against minorities, as the Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues just mentioned. There was further concern regarding the anti-conversion laws, which are not compliant with international human rights standards, something that was raised even in so far back as when Asma Jahangir was the mandate holder. So, we're talking 4 mandate holders back regarding the initial concerns raising anti-conversion laws. Then there was hate speech and incitement to religious hatred, and I won't repeat that. Regarding the UPR recommendations, in view of the above, a number of recommendations that were raised in the 3rd UPR cycle still are highly relevant and should be taken on board by the Indian authorities. For example, those that relate to retracting anti-conversion laws, other laws restricting freedom of religion or belief and the rights of minorities, especially religious minorities, discrimination, exclusion, and marginalization against them. Those recommendations that aim to prevent acts of violence based on religion or belief and targeting religious minorities, ensuring access to justice and accountability, and those that address hate speech and incitement to religious violence and combating this. So in conclusion, the situations addressed by this mandate and the concerns that have been conveyed depict a broad context of rising discrimination and attacks against religious minorities in India, and these have been fostered by laws and regulations that deepen their exclusion and increasingly marginalize them. They are fueled by hate speech, especially through social media, and this exacerbates the acts of violence against minorities on grounds of their religious affiliation. I want to draw attention to the general statement in the press release that was issued on the 22nd of August, the International Day to commemorate the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief, and point out a number of standards that are binding upon the government of India, along with others. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ghanea, for your intervention, and welcome to your new mandate. And we look forward to working with you, collaborating with you, and carrying forward the heritage that you have acquired now as the mandate holder on freedom of religion or belief. Our next speaker, our 4th speaker in our lineup, will be Mr. Garnett Genuis, who is Member of Parliament for Sherwood Park Fort, Saskatchewan, Canada. And Mr. Genuis will speak to the very central issue, to my mind, of how can the international community support the Indian government to uphold the rights of minorities. Mr. Genuis, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. Greetings. It's a pleasure to be able to join such a distinguished panel, and I hope my comments will add to the conversation. I wanted to start off with a couple sort of general framing comments. The first is that I see great value in mutually respectful and mutually beneficial dialogue about human rights among democracies. India has human rights challenges, and it's also a democracy in which human rights concerns can be voiced both inside and outside the country. Our voices today align with people in India who are also saying similar things. So my hope is that my comments today constructively contribute to that shared conversation. Now, the nature of mutually respectful dialogue among democracies is a recognition that both sides have things to learn. My country, Canada, certainly has its own problems. Last summer, over 60 churches in Canada faced attacks, including several being burned to the ground. The political circumstances around these attacks were such that they were almost completely ignored at the political level. Certain acts of vandalism were praised on social media, and one very prominent former staff member of the Prime Minister called these attacks wrong but understandable. Canada's government has also used the Draconian Emergencies Act to clear protesters and freeze bank accounts, and one Canadian province prohibits the wearing of religious symbols in certain professions. I welcome commentary from Indian politicians and others on these Canadian problems, and I raise them only to underscore that mutually respectful human rights dialogue should not involve anyone presuming a position of superiority. Now, the second general framing comment that I want to make is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights emphasizes a doctrine of religious freedom, which is about individual freedom to seek God in one's own way and not simply about the peaceful coexistence of existing communities. I'm sure all of the panelists and many of those listening are aware of this already, but Article 18 says everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others and in public or private to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. So the right of conversion flows fundamentally from the idea of universal human dignity. Religious freedom is not about protecting the size and power of existing communities, but rather about respecting the dignity and freedom of all human persons as the basis for supporting their own individual search for God and truth, which can include either embracing or rejecting the faith they were raised in. Now, in the worst performers on religious freedom, existing religious minority communities are denied the right to exist or face systematic harassment. For intermediate performers, though, there is often an aspiration for peaceful coexistence among communities, but failure to respect the individual rights component, especially as it relates to conversion. So, particular to the situation in India, I wanted to say that my perception from spending time in India and following ongoing reports and debates on human rights there is that there is an important overlay involving issues of religion and issues of caste. So I'm pleased we're discussing both of these today. Inevitably, these comparisons contain holes, but the caste system has many features in common with systems of racial discrimination in the Western world. People have been treated as more or less valuable based on race in the West or caste background in India, and have also been seen as suited narrowly to certain kinds of roles within society. Now, when it comes to racial discrimination in the West and caste discrimination in India, certainly it can be said that progress has been made in certain respects. But as we discuss often in the West, unconscious bias, as well as the present outworkings of past discrimination, have major implications today, even after ameliorative measures have been in place for a long time. In India, unlike in the West, this caste system has been seen as linked to Hinduism, even though caste-based discrimination still confronts members of other faiths and can exist within other faith communities. So what is the link between caste-based and religious discrimination? Those in India who have been historically marginalized based on caste have access to what are called reservations, a form of affirmative action. However, a person who converts to Christianity or Islam loses their access to reservations based on the notion that caste is not a part of Christianity or Islam. But while these religions reject the caste system, members of these faith communities still can face caste-based discrimination. At a practical and social level, a person in India can no more opt out of the history of caste than a Black person in the United States or an Indigenous person in Canada can opt out of the ongoing implications of past and present racism. Denying Christians and Muslims access to the same kinds of ameliorative measures that are available to others has the effect of compounding caste discrimination with religious discrimination. Now, since I began engaging with these issues, there has been a significant growth in state-level anti-conversion laws in India. These laws have been mentioned already. They're nominally designed to prevent religious conversion through force, undue influence, or allurement, and thus involve the state reviewing a person's decision to convert and preventing them from converting if state authorities thus decide. With effective wide discretion, these laws allow state authorities to be selective, celebrating conversion to the majority faith while blocking conversions that involve the embrace of a minority position. Now, what I have found in conversations with people about these laws seems to me to honestly be a certain implied pejorative attitude towards people who convert, especially so-called lower caste people. Such people may be presumed to not understand or be sophisticated enough to make their own religious decisions and therefore are presumed to be acting from undue pressure or allurement. The argument is that such simple people need to be protected from pressure and deception. This discourse, again, links caste prejudice to religious discrimination. As has been discussed as well, there is growing concern about violence targeting minorities and those with certain caste backgrounds. When it comes to violence, politicians of all stripes should clearly condemn violence, oppose incitement, and challenge the leadership of organizations that participate in violence. But it's important to understand the connection between these legal realities and that violence. Worsening legal realities, such as the expansion and tightening of anti-conversion laws, contribute to a dangerous climate and reinforce negative stereotypes based on caste and religion. In a way, these laws lend credibility to narratives around the denial of human dignity and human rights, which also lead to violence. In conclusion, India is the world's largest democracy with a constitutionally enshrined protection for religious pluralism. I hope that Indian states will reverse course and start repealing anti-conversion laws, provide equal access to services and reservations regardless of religion, and seek to create a culture in which universal human dignity is affirmed and all violence is roundly condemned. Thank you again to the organizers of this and to all of you for your important work.
Thank you very much, Mr. Genuis. I very much appreciate the fact that it's been, of course, present in almost all the interventions thus far, but the way in which you've so explicitly highlighted the particular intersection between discrimination based on religion and discrimination based on caste in the Indian context, I think is absolutely critical and certainly something very dear to our hearts in the World Council of Churches. So thank you very much for that. I'm sure we'll hear more about that from the remaining speakers. So I move now to our next speaker, who has really the impossible task. I'm sorry, Sunita, you have the impossible task of, within the space of 3 minutes, describing for us the broader context, Hindutva, and the decay of Indian democracy. Completely impossible in 3 minutes, but hopefully you can at least give us a slight flavor of the context in which this discussion is taking place. So I give the floor to Ms. Sunita Viswanath, who represents Hindus for Human Rights. Sunita, the floor is yours for 3 minutes, sadly.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. Navratri is a very auspicious time for Hindus, and for Hindus for Human Rights, during Navratri, we meditate on the mother goddess in all her aspects as she slays the enemies of peace, truth, and justice. Navratri wishes to all of you. My name is Sunita Viswanath, and I'm the co-founder and executive director of Hindus for Human Rights. We co-founded this organization in the wake of Narendra Modi's re-election in the summer of 2019. I was alarmed to find that despite the fact that Modi's Hindu nationalist government tarnished the name of Hinduism, I could not find a group who spoke with a Hindu voice against the weaponization of our faith and against intolerance and communal violence. Instead, I saw Hindu American organizations rally for Modi in Houston and cheer India's precipitous fall into majoritarianism. We co-founded Hindus for Human Rights then to reclaim Hinduism and to provide a space for Hindus around the world to unequivocally denounce the persecution of minorities in India, to stand opposed to Hindu extremism, Hindutva, and caste. That same summer, we were the only Hindus standing with placards outside the ugly display of hatred dubbed Howdy Modi, and my placard read, "Real Hindus don't lynch." To understand what's happening in India today, you have to understand the Hindu nationalist movement. The movement, known as Hindutva, wants India to become a state for and by Hindus only. Hindutva leaders will allege that the word Hindutva means Hinduness, but the tenets of Hindutva are antithetical to the Hinduism that I practice. While Hinduism celebrates diversity, Hindutva wants to create a mono identity for Indians and Hindus grounded in sexism, casteism, and above all, religious supremacy. While Hindus for Human Rights is proud of an India where people of all faith traditions exist together, Hindutva seems ashamed of this pluralistic vision of India. The Hindutva movement emerged in the early 20th century with the founding of the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, as an alternative to the democratic movement that eventually won India its independence. Hindutva leaders believed that an independent India could only thrive if Indians rallied around a nationalist Hindu identity and were led by a strong authoritarian. Despite their efforts, Hindutva was pushed to the fringes of Indian politics, and from the fringes they wreaked terror, even going so far as to assassinate India's national icon, Mahatma Gandhi, whose 153rd birth anniversary we commemorated yesterday. At the same time, leaders of the movement methodically carved a path to the mainstream, and now India's government is led by a lifelong and ardent RSS supporter, Narendra Modi. In this position, Modi has stacked his government with fellow Hindu nationalists, and together they have cracked down on anyone who dares criticize the government's project to transform India into a Hindu nationalist state. Through the use of anti-terror laws, such as the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, to arbitrarily arrest critics of Hindutva, the introduction of state-level anti-conversion laws, and the passage of the Citizenship Amendment Act, the Indian government clearly wants to silence and persecute minorities. Just last week, Indian authorities arrested more than 100 members of Islamic organizations, including the Popular Front of India, for supposed anti-national activities. In reality, these activists were arrested for the crime of being Muslim. At the same time that the Indian government has cracked down on critics of Hindutva, the Indian government has allowed people to attack minority communities with impunity. This is unsurprising for a government led by the same man who, as Chief Minister of Gujarat, refused to intervene when Hindu mobs terrorized Muslims during the 2002 Gujarat pogroms. When Hindutva mobs repeated the violent pogroms of 2002 in Delhi in 2020, Modi said nothing. In December 2021, when Hindu leaders, saffron-clad leaders, called for the genocide of Muslims, Modi stayed silent. Over the course of his career, Modi refuses to denounce anti-minority violence, and he knows that his strategic silence is tacit approval for the violence. I ask UN member states to call on Indian government officials to denounce hate speech that's targeted violence against minorities in their recommendations to the Indian government. To be clear, the Indian government is an active persecutor of India's minorities, but Modi's strategic silence allows him to deny that well-documented fact that the Indian government persecutes these minorities. The Indian government must be forced to denounce on the record the political movement that drove it to power and the anti-minority violence we all know that it encourages. This is not enough, of course, and my fellow panelists will outline. Member states should ask the Indian government as well to repeal the many laws that restrict the abilities of minorities to exercise their full rights as Indian citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would just like to invite everybody in the audience to reflect on how different the reality described by Ms. Viswanath is compared to the historical legacy dating back to the period of Emperor Ashoka of inclusiveness and of respect for diversity that was presented to us in Dr. Benzo's opening remarks. So we move to the next speaker, who is Mr. Ajit Sahi, representing the Indian American Muslim Council. Over to you, sir. And if possible, please try to stick a little close to 3 minutes so we preserve some time for questions and answers.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Mr. Prove. One of the downsides of going near the last of a program is that anything you wanted to say has already been said by almost everybody. One of the upsides of representing a civil rights organization is that you can truly speak your mind. And I think that's what I'm going to do for the next 3 minutes. Let's just look at what is at stake here. You know, we have already done a complete 360-degree encapsulation of what's going on in India. But what is at stake? India's UPR, the Universal Periodic Review, is next month. And what is at stake here? Well, India is the world's largest democracy. And we call it the world's largest democracy because it has the world's second largest population after China. And China, as we all very well know, is not a democracy. But let me just break the news to you. In another couple of years, it's quite possible that India will cease to be the world's largest democracy, and that mantle is going to fall on the United States of America on the strength of its population. Or what's happening here is that India is about to lose its democracy. And I'm saying this with complete recognition of what this means. The next elections, general elections in India, are due in May of 2024, which is less than 2 years from now, which is about 20 months from now. And we have already seen the BJP, India's ruling party, win 2 back-to-back elections. Their vote share is pretty strong. So now what's happening is that the Western countries, who are really the most powerful in terms of running the process at the United Nations Human Rights Council, they are beginning to increasingly ignore what's going on in India because for a whole variety of reasons, from defense ties to business ties and all of that stuff. It's quite likely that the West, including in North America and Western Europe, will continue to ignore because they are eyeing the big markets, the big resources coming out of India. And that's going to be disastrous, absolutely disastrous, not just for India. It's going to be disastrous for the rest of the world and especially for the Western countries. I say this because back in the day, 75 years ago, when India gained independence from British colonial rule, it proved to be a bellwether. India's freedom from British colonial rule excited millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world. And in the next 20 years, we saw a rash of, we saw a run for democracy in most parts of the world. You look at Africa, you look at Latin America, you look at Southeast Asia, everywhere. And now that we are literally facing a collapse of democracy in India, I fear that there will be a run for a collapse of democracy in the rest of the world. I will conclude by reminding you that the Vidam Institute of Sweden has already said that India is an electoral autocracy. The Freedom House, which is one of the very respected research organizations in the United States, has for the last 2 years downgraded India's democracy from being free to partly free. It is about minority rights, but it is about a lot more than just minority rights. You are looking at a complete authoritarian country that is being shaped into existence under the leadership of Narendra Modi, India's current prime minister. It is absolutely of great significance to all the Western countries. If you do not stop India right now, India will destroy peace and democracy in the rest of the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ajit. I think admirably presented and in a very concise manner. Thank you so much. So I move to our second last speaker, Ms. Hena Zuberi, who represents Justice for All. Hena, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Salam and greetings of peace and safety. I hope everyone and their loved ones are safe and well during these trying times. And thank you for convening this gathering. As you have heard, since 2017, the government of India has put in place a body of laws and procedures on nationality and citizenship, and I'd like to concentrate on this. These are discriminatory against minorities, especially Muslims. Nearly, as you heard before, that 2 million Assami citizens, residents, around 6% of the state's population, has been cast as doubtful nationality, despite fundamental concerns about poor and discriminatory procedures that exclude religious and linguistic minorities, especially women and children among them, highlighted by many victim groups as well as human rights bodies. Authorities have confirmed the finality of the NRC. And I want to talk a little bit about the NRC. Appeals against exclusions are supposed to be heard by these foreign tribunals that in law have power to declare any individual as a foreigner and order their confinement into detention centers. Now, these are detention centers much like we see in China. And this is not just in the state of Assam. We see them in Punjab. We see them in other states around India. Human rights bodies have documented how foreigners' tribunals are designed to exclude mostly Muslims. And as a Muslim woman with roots in India, it pains me that the most impacted are women who are often identified by the men in their families and often do not have documentation. Combine this with the threats of sexual violence coming from genocidal conferences being held by people who lead temples, not one, not two. The lead of this genocidal conference that took place in December, Yati Narsinganan, leads 400,000 temples. That is not fringe, that's mainstream. And if we look at these, yesterday had a chance to talk about sexual violence against Muslim women, and just as you do this research and you look at this every day, you look at the world and you don't see people reacting to it with the sort of intensity that they should be reacting. It really, as civil rights leaders, as human rights leaders, as representatives against the impact of genocide around the world, it is really like we argued with many of you all about the impending genocide of the Rohingyas. Justice for All, this is a 30 years history of anti-genocide work, especially on the Rohingya genocide under our Burma Task Force. We believe that state-sanctioned discrimination of citizens acts are a precursor for brutal genocidal acts. The UN General Assembly agrees with us on this point, and here I'd like to quote the UN resolution. The extreme levels of violence perpetuated against the Rohingya in 2016 and 2017 resulted from the systematic oppression and persecution of the Rohingya, including the denial of their legal status, identity, and citizenship. The suggestion for an independent investigative mechanism for India, as for the one on Myanmar, is excellent. I would really recommend that. Again, thank you so much, UN Special Rapporteur, for mentioning that. As the Holocaust Museum's early warning project predicts the mass killings in India, what will happen? Where will these refugees go? Bangladesh to Pakistan, where 1/3 of Pakistan is underwater? There's too much at stake. And just to end, I'm going to say the coalition recommends, regarding the National Register of Citizens in Assam, commencement appeals process within a time-bound calendar and ensure that the foreigners, it's telling me to shut up now, and foreigners tribunal follow set procedures and protocols for hearing appeals and weighing the evidence. We would also recommend to amend the Citizenship Act to remove religion as an eligibility criterion in line with the international human rights standards. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Hina. Now we just have a few minutes left, but we have one more speaker, and I would like very much to encourage Reverend Gideon Jibamani, who represents the International Commission for Dalit Rights, to speak to us. The floor is yours, sir.
Greetings from the International Commission for Dalit Rights. I see dear advocates for a just and equitable society for Dalits and marginalized people who have been intergenerationally excluded across South Asia and USA and around the world. I am Gideon Jabamani from Dalit community in India, currently working as a ministerial chaplain for New York State in US and serving as a board of director at the ICDR. Dalits and scheduled tribes are the most suffering from religious intolerance in India, regardless of their religious belief. Dalit Christians are a significant minority, constituting of 50 million of the 24 million Indian Christian population. Dalit Christian and Dalit Muslims are victims of intersectional vulnerabilities as Dalits and as Christians or Muslim identity. They face threefold discrimination by state, society at large, and within the faith due to intersectional religious and caste identity. This triple or multiple oppression of Dalit Christian led to denial of their dignity, rights, and entitlement. Dalit Buddhists have the affirmative action, likewise Dalit Sikhs. Whereas Dalit Christian and Dalit Muslims, they were denied. This discriminates Dalit Christian and Dalit Muslim from access to education and development and political representation, thereby discriminating further on the basis of religion. This protection given through the Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribe Prevention of Atrocities Act 1989 is denied in its application for Dalit Christians and Dalit Muslims, thereby denying access to justice. Dalit Christians and Dalit Muslims face economic deprivation, and large proportion of them are forced into caste-based menial and manual occupations intergenerationally, washer folk, removal of carcasses and burial and crematory workers, leather workers, bonded laborers, manual scavenging workers, etc. A large proportion of them still are landless and largely depend on dominant caste community for their livelihood. I therefore put forward 4 key recommendations. 1. Repeal para 3 of Presidential Order 1950, making the ambit of scheduled caste as religion neutral and thus extend benefits of affirmative action to all Dalits irrespective of their religion, as recommended by National Commission on Religious and Linguistic Minorities, UN Special Rapporteur and agencies. Number 2, extend to Dalit Christian protection and benefits under the Protection of Civil Rights Act 1955, Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act 1989, amended in 2015, and the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act, Forest Rights Act 2006. Number 3, effectively implement and protect the rights of minorities by repealing all state enacted anti-conversion laws, as it is already pointed out, and further prohibit the enactment of such laws in other states. Enact the Prevention of Communal and Targeted Violence, Access to Justice and Reparations Bill 2013, which was approved by the Indian Cabinet in December 2013. I appeal to all member states, UN experts and civil society leaders to address this key issue and protect Christians, Muslims, and any other Dalits from further exclusion and systemic violence. Jai Bhim. Thank you.
Jai Bhim. Thank you, Reverend Gideon. So thank you, everybody. Excellent interventions from everybody on the panel. I only regret that we have essentially used up our available time, and so there isn't really a substantial amount of time left for questions and answers. I do, however, want to acknowledge some of the questions that have been raised. And then I'm going to see if there's any very, very quick responses that any of those who might feel inspired to respond to those matters from the panel can address. And then I'm going to ask, just as he started us so well, I'm going to ask Dr. Benzo for some very short concluding words. So I've seen one question directed to Dr. de Varennes with regard to his mention of the possibility of investigative mechanisms or a report by the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights. Given the current political climate and India's influence internationally, how likely is this to happen? And what can be done to increase the likelihood of an international investigation on the situation of minorities in India? And there was also a second question that referred to the fact that the influence of violent Hindu nationalism isn't confined to India's own borders, but is evident in some other contexts. The incidents in Leicester were specifically referred to. So there was a question then to whether governments, other governments are also concerned about this in their own context, and maybe that's something also that Mr. Genuis and or Dr. Benzo might themselves want to respond to, if not others. But first to you, Dr. Varennes, do you have a quick answer? It's not something that is commends itself to a quick answer, I'm afraid, but do you have a quick response to the question specifically posed to you?
Very quickly, the UN Security Council resolution, highly unlikely. A resolution from the Human Rights Council, possible. But if we look at the example, the situation of the Uyghur in China, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights proceeded with this kind of investigation without a resolution from either. So there is, from the most likely to the less likely, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights Council, and highly unlikely the Security Council.
Thank you, Dr. Varennes. Mr. Genuis, would you like to respond to the issue about the influence of violent Hindu nationalism outside of India?
Well, maybe I'll just say in general that I think individual states need to deal seriously with issues of foreign involvement, whether by governments or by specific organizations that have troubling track records on their soil. This is an issue we're grappling with in Canada, and the debate has mainly been driven by concerns about Chinese state influence in Canada. But we know there are other actors as well, and we know how international actors want to shape conversations that happen about human rights. So there. The specific instance that was referred to in the UK, obviously not something that is in my context, but these are certainly live debates in terms of what the kind of role of some of these kinds of actors and ideologies are having in our country.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody else who would like to intervene in response to either of these two questions before I revert to Dr. Benzo for closing words? If that's not the case, then it's over to you, Dr. Benzo. And once again, before we close, I just want to thank everybody for their extraordinary inputs within such a short space of time, and thanks to all the audience as well. But over to you, Dr. Benzo.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank the organizers once more for giving us the opportunity to make our contribution to this insightful and stimulating discussion. I will just highlight 4 main points that, in my view, may help summarize today's debate. First, the condition of minorities is a test for any democracy in India and elsewhere. When minorities suffer, the whole democratic system is under pressure. Second, there should be no tension between the notions of citizenship and minority. The term minority should not be misused to claim that members of a certain community are not fully part of a nation, of its history and its culture. Third, when it comes to religious intolerance, the distance between words and deeds that is between hate speech and physical violence, is very short. Therefore, we need to tackle the former before it rapidly evolves into the latter. Fourth, and this specifically relates to my mandate as Special Envoy, interreligious dialogue and cooperation may be powerful drivers for positive change. Freedom of religion or belief are two, and interreligious dialogue are two mutually reinforcing dimensions, and I believe they should be pushed accordingly. I hope the upcoming UPR will be for India and the other countries involved in the next session a moment of constructive engagement with a view to speeding up the alignment of the national legislations to the international standards on human rights. Once again, thanks a lot for your insightful remarks and for giving us this interesting opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Benzo. Thanks once again to the organizers and conveners, and of course to our excellent speakers. Thanks once again to all of you who have listened in and asked questions in this webinar. And we look forward to continuing to collaborate in addressing these issues of concern going forward, including during the UPR of India, but also beyond that. So thank you very much. And this webinar is now at an end. Thank you.